Step in my dojo, you
Step in my dojo, you
step in my.
The way people digest things is in terms of a narrative. You know, you need to tell a story with your body and with the dance. You know, it's got that you need to be able to do sick moves that you've practiced, but you don't just like walk up and just do your sickest move right away and then just do more of that for the entire routine. It doesn't make sense as a routine unless there's like a narrative to it, and unless there's like a structure, and you know, you build up to the big moments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're composing and arranging music for dancers, you need to really think like, you know, like, because a lot of people, they say they like to imagine a band in their head, and I used to often imagine a band in my head when I was creating my sounds, and like, you know, there'd be like a crazy little robot guy over here, and there'd be like some alien with 4 arms over there just like shredding like 4 keyboards at once and whatever, you know. And I just like would use my imagination and do that, and that can definitely help you write music. But I think for this exercise, I would like to encourage you to imagine a dance routine in your head. Like, imagine first maybe one person and then other group members coming in, or however, but really try and imagine like what physical actions do each of these parts have. And I started mentally picturing a dance routine when I'm writing dance music instead of a band a while ago, and I do it every time now. And I find that it really, really helps to figure out, like, you know, what sounds go where and why, and also to help you to see what isn't happening in your track and get, because I mean, so much of being experienced as a music producer is the ability to tell what's not happening. You know, like when you're starting out, the questions you ask are like, hey, you know, is this snare drum loud? Is this kick drum, you know, banging enough? Is that like, am I EQing my bass properly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, as you gain more and more experience, there are these levels that you kind of unlock, and once you unlock that level, you're like, oh, this is, you know, you listen to music where the person hasn't had that insight for themselves yet, and they haven't evolved through that level. And when you're past that level, you look at that music and you're like, oh, this is not happening, you know. And it can be, that can be like a technological thing too. For example, like a lot of the time, if you listen to music from like electronic music from the beginning of electronic music, like when people weren't sequencing with computers and MIDI editing, like you wouldn't even really edit MIDI. You'd either play it live or put a little pattern into like a pattern sequencer. And when you were recording to tape, you know, you'd have to basically like move all the little faders on the mixer and stuff live. And it wasn't unheard of for someone to like have a couple friends over so that they could have extra hands when they're recording the final version of a track, because they didn't have the ability to comp things together. So when you listen to a lot of music from like the 90s and the 80s and everything, it sounds like really, really repetitive, and like all of the parts are made of these like, you know, 8 or 16 step patterns with like just slow modulation on them, rather than actually like, you know, lots of patterns changing throughout the song, etc. So training yourself is a lot about hearing what isn't there. And when you are really thinking about dance, it's one of those levels. Like when you really are understanding how people dance to music is definitely one of those levels. And when you can train your ear to start listening like a dancer would, it's really, really going to make your music a lot better. So one of the things that is a complaint that I often hear dancers make is dancers will say, this music, there's nothing for me to do. You know, there's lots of sounds here, but there's nothing for me to do. Like the groove is staying the same the whole time. And it makes a track really hard to kind of like create this like dynamic story within the dance when you have, I call this style of composition the layer cake, where basically you have all these nice loops, you know, they're all really nice parts, and maybe they're not like from a loop library, like maybe they're loops that the producer has made during the creation of this track, but the composition articulates as it goes through the arrangement by adding or subtracting layers. And that's basically the only thing that happens to each layer, is that it's either in or it's out, right? And that you often end up with a situation where you have lots of parts, and each one of those parts is like really sick individually, but the fact that there's just so many of these parts all the time, all on top of each other all the time, it makes the whole thing feel the same, because the density, the compositional density of the number of parts in the composition is not really changing. It's always lots, you know, it's never 1 or 0 or 2, you know, it's always like 10 layers at once, right? And then, like, you know, that's where it becomes the cake, and the cake is rich and it has a lot of ingredients in it and stuff, but it's a big, thick, rich, overwhelming piece of cake. Sometimes you got to cut the cake. Sometimes you got to take a layer off, you know, sometimes maybe you just want a fingerful of the icing, you know, but the cake can be way too much when you compose that way. And it's a problem that I see again and again and again in producers, is you know, there's always, like, let's say there's always 7 layers in the composition. They might take one out and reintroduce another one, but it's always just a constant level of 7 layers at once, right? Because the tendency is to keep adding stuff until you can't add any more stuff, which is great for some sections of the song, but if you've added parts until you literally can't fit any more parts in all the time, then every section of your track has the same compositional density. To understand what is going to make sense in terms of motion, we need to analyze a little bit about how the different parts of the song interact with the different parts of your body. And I want to show you a couple fundamental things to understand about rhythm and dance. You're on your feet, you're listening to music, you're at a venue, and the music starts washing over you and you feel like dancing. What do you typically do? How do you typically express yourself? Well, almost everyone will start by nodding their head to the beat, right? Getting the whole spine feeling the groove, right? Feeling the groove first. And the groove is, I made a weekly download about this called the Rhythm Guide, right? And the Rhythm Guide, well, you can look at that, but the Rhythm Guide is basically the rhythm of the basic groove of the beat, okay? And usually there's not that much variation in that, because that's basically the frequency at which you nod your head, or whether you're nodding your head or not. When you're making drops almost always, to, you know, get people doing the like headbang on the rail dance, needs to just be quarter notes, just like boom. To, you know, get people doing the like headbang on the rail dance, needs to just be quarter notes, just like boom, bap, boom, bap, you know, and just like quarter notes. And it's got to be kind of like any faster than about 100 BPM, and people stop doing that dance, because it's just like, it doesn't have that, like, you can't get that full body headbang in there past 100 BPM, right? So usually it's quarter notes below about 100 BPM. So whether you're counting at double time at, like, you know, let's say you're listening to drum and bass, some people count drum and bass at 87 and a half, some people count it at 175, you know, it depends, but you can dance like half time at the 87 and a half and still do that dance. But yeah, usually a drop is gonna be like a steady kind of quarter note type pulse, And then as things progress and these other layers, maybe the offbeats come in, or maybe there's some 3/4 going like that sort of a rhythm over top, that will kind of like evolve the groove and lead into that more horizontal mode. But usually the groove starts out with your spine, and the rhythm guide. The rhythm guide is essentially, it's the rhythm of your spine. It's the rhythm of your head nodding. And when you listen to a piece of music, you can usually kind of like clap out, like even though the time signature is not changing, the frequency of the main rhythm guide often does throughout a song. And you can like basically clap your hands or click the mouse and put MIDI notes or whatever you want and kind of highlight this groove. So a lot of the time in the big, like, a track will go back and forth between these different fundamental rhythms. It'll start by being like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there'll be a build up. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's still like, but the beat is still a 4 count, but you feel a double bounce, right, to the rhythm, and that will kind of, the track will evolve in that way, right? But always start with like, what is the rhythm guide doing? What is the rhythm of your head nodding? Right? And then sometimes there's pauses in the rhythm guide too. Like let's say there's a big turnaround at the end of a fill, or maybe there's a big explosion noise and then just no sounds except for reverb, like, well, then the rhythm guide would stop. The beat hasn't stopped, the song hasn't stopped, but the rhythm guide has stopped. That fundamental rhythm of, is it halftime? Is it double time? That that rhythm guide hasn't stopped. So that's normally the first place to start. But then when you're dancing, right, if you think about how dancers typically will interact with music, right, a lot of the time the frequencies of the sound, where the part sits, will actually, the EQ is kind of reflected on a vertical axis on the human body. Not always, but usually the EQ is reflected in a kind of vertical axis, right? So you will often get like the snares will be reflected in the shoulders, in the chest, like a chest pop, or like shoulders bouncing back or out, right? And then the feet, are kind of like stomping and moving with the main kick drum and the sub. Like it just feels like you should move your feet. And the sub kind of forms the foundation. The sub and the kick are kind of like the foundation. If the song was a person, that they would be the legs. They would be the legs and the hips, right? So now, if you're, performing in a kind of theatrical way versus if you're just dancing and listening, that's going to definitely have the greatest effect on your arms. Your arms and basically like the body groove in the upper body and the arms, that's where you're connecting with the face of the song, right? And the face is usually, but not always, in the frequency range between about like 1K and about 5K, which would be like where a human voice would sit typically. Also like that area between about 3K and 4K, that's like the kind of pain zone. That's the frequency of like a baby crying. And your ears are really, really sensitive to that frequency because we gotta, not have our babies die, right? So usually that kind of frequency range, like if it's a vocal song, you might be singing along while you're dancing, but if the song has some like guitars, or perhaps synthesizer motions, you're going to be like expressing those with your hands, as well as the snare is usually in the upper body, right? And if you watch people, like another good thing to do is to watch people while they rap. A lot of rappers will do stuff with their hands that is really, these are kind of like motions where you're not just reflecting the snare, but you're also reflecting like the main, face of the song, where the kind of main focus of the listener's ear usually is. So that's why a lot of the time, the main melody in the song will be like a synth lead sitting in that area, or alarm noises, or vocal chops, or you know, other, just like that's typically, because that's where you hear the most detail, and that's typically where like the most action in the song is, and that's also where you have the most rhythmic freedom. First level of rhythm is like what BPM is the track, and you know, what is the time signature. So is it going 1 2 3 1 2 3 like a waltz, or is it going 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 like pretty much most music, right? So this is 4/4 150 BPM. That's the most fundamental level of rhythm, and that level of rhythm doesn't have anything to do with the song. But this song, I want to make a rhythm guide. Okay, first, so the rhythm guide, in this case, I'm going to start with quarter notes. Okay, so this is going to be the rhythm guide to start. Okay, and then the next progression of the rhythm guide, I'm going to go to double time. Right? Now, this one is back to simple, but you can also add like a syncopation. So like, let's say this is where the funky rhythm comes in. So I'm going to make it a little syncopation. So it's like boom, 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 boom. And this one is going to be the last evolution, and that's going to be this. Okay, so we've got straight and then double time, and then we've got syncopated and then double time. So straight. Right, like that makes sense. You can dance to that. So now that we have a rhythm guide, let's turn that rhythm guide into a beat. So all you got to do is change what sounds are played. So okay, so now okay, so now this is that same rhythm guide, but I've moved which actual sounds get played, and now this is going to sound a lot more familiar to your ears than just the straight rhythm guide. Oh wait, I forgot to do that last snare. But now you can see this sounds a lot more familiar. And I'm going to do this. So I thought that sounded a bit better. But yeah, so this sounds a lot more like beats, you know, so that beats you know and love. But you see how, you know, basically the rhythmic complexity is stepping up 4 different levels here just with these 3 different sounds. You know, we've got straight with the extra hi-hat, and then we got syncopated, and then we got like full double time syncopation, right? And you can really, like, when you bob your head to these beats, it feels like each one of these is a very different evolution. They're different, but they're related. You know, you're not gonna surprise a dancer with any of these progressions. These progressions are gonna make sense. What gets you actually like into the dance is to have some stuff to act out, right? Like there's this kind of unspoken rhythmic framework that's just always there in dance music. But if you're not just at a club chilling, you know, you're at an event, like, and you're doing a show on a stage or on TV or whatever, you need to have some stuff to do. So basically this is like, to an extent, where stuff happens, but this isn't what stuff happens, if that makes sense. You know, this is basically like a playground, you know, where there's like a jungle gym and there's some swings and there's some, you know, tires and stuff, but no one's doing anything yet. This is just all setting musically. Like, yeah, this stuff has to be the loudest and it's keeping time for the whole track, and they're like the most important elements of the track, you know, the kick, the snare, the groove of the drum beat. Yeah, for sure, they're the most important and the top of the sonic hierarchy of how powerful they should be in the mix. But at the same time, kicks and snares and hi-hats and stuff, they don't make a track. You know, they're nice to have, and you can sometimes have some that you're like, oh, that's good, but it's like when you're, you know, like it's weird when a band has a noticeable drummer. You know what I'm saying? Like that's not where your attention is, like, mostly. So what the other main thing that is bringing the dance together is the sub, okay? And the sub, this is basically like where your kind of ass happens, and where are there slides that you're kind of moving in with? Are you just bouncing up and down, etc., right? So the sub is like really that, and how the sub interacts with the rest of the groove. That's what brings your whole body in together. Like usually when people are going to act something out, it'll be like a vocal line, or maybe there's like a rewind and some like laser noises or something, and you've listened to the track a few times and you're like, oh, I'm acting this thing out. But most of the time what you're doing while you're just kind of dancing to this song, waiting for your special moment, it's the sub that you're dancing to. So that, the timing of the arm motions and the shoulder motions and everything, that's basically the kick and the snare. But the sub is like your feet and your whole spine, your whole body, right? So that sub cannot just be an afterthought. It cannot just be an afterthought. It is an essential part of what makes the track interesting. And it's really important that that sub tells a story.